Good afternoon, folks. Thank you for joining us today. We have an exciting discussion about land use and local communities, and we're going to talk about siting and stakeholder engagement, certainly important topics here. I am really pleased to be joined by a great panel here. My name is Jacob Weinberg. I am the Senior Communications Manager for the Solar Energy Industries Association, and I am joined by Mayani Barudin, who is the founder and executive director of Sovereign Energy, Maren Taylor, director of Regulatory Affairs and Counsel for SEIA, and David Gall, executive director of the Solar and Storage Institute. So really happy to, or Solar and Storage Industries Institute, rather. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me today. And yeah, we'll just dive right in. So Mayani, can you share a little bit more about what you do and Sovereign Energy?
Guatsi Hopa, Mayani Chavez Brudenmensa, Skiwama Suota, Naitra, Dikotia. Good morning, afternoon, everyone. I'm Mayani Chavez Bruden, as founder and executive director of Sovereign Energy. I'm from Santo Domingo, Giwa Pueblo, which is located in New Mexico, right in between Albuquerque and Santa Fe, and one of the 23 federally recognized tribes in New Mexico. And I started Sovereign Energy as a Native woman-led nonprofit, really to fill gaps that we see within our own communities to have our renewable energy visions. So we work on a number of different program areas, including renewable energy education, tribal capacity building, policy and regulatory advocacy, as well as cultural resource protection. And our mission is to build the individual and collective power of Southwest tribes and pueblos to create a just, interdependent, and regenerative energy future. So yeah, happy to share more, and thank you all for joining us today.
And Maren, can you talk about what you do for SEIA?
Yep, sure. So like Jacob said, I'm Maren Taylor, Director of Regulatory Affairs and Counsel at SEIA. I function as sort of our environmental counsel at SEIA, and I work primarily with utility scale developers on siting and permitting. I work a lot with our developers on environmental considerations and how the siting and permitting process functions on both public and private lands. I work closely with the administration, so I am a member of our regulatory affairs team, so I work with agencies like DOE, BLM, and EPA on siting regulations, and closely with our legislative affairs team as well on Hill advocacy.
David, can you tell us about the Solar and Storage Industries Institute?
Great, yeah, thanks, Jacob. David Gall, Executive Director of the Solar and Storage Industries Institute. The Institute is a nonprofit organization that's focused on accelerating the clean energy transition. So we do that through research, education, policy analysis work, and we're sort of focused on all the big bottlenecks that are affecting solar and storage deployment across the country. So we're looking at interconnection policy, we're looking at siting and permitting regulations and trying to streamline some processes there. And we have a big grant to focus on community engagement strategies and improve those strategies to help large-scale solar projects really attain the social license to operate in communities across the country.
Awesome. So I think it'd be great, Maren, you're certainly an expert on this stuff. Can you maybe just give us a lay of the land about what the land use and siting process looks like?
Yeah, sure. So a lot of this will probably be old news to many of you, but just to kind of provide maybe a foundation for our conversation, I can talk a little bit about how we work on siting and permitting at SEIA, and some of the challenges that are involved in siting utility scale projects. So siting and permitting, as you all know, is the sort of earliest and one of the most difficult and time-consuming parts of utility scale projects. According to Lawrence Berkeley National Labs, it's consistently cited as one of the top challenges for developers, and I know we'll touch on some of those reasons a little bit later. So a few just sort of basic things to note about siting. There's a long list of considerations that developers have to take into account when they're looking at siting utility scale projects. The first sort of falls into the physical characteristics bucket. So not surprising, you have to find a site that is flat and sunny, little risk of flood or water features that are going to interfere with the panels. There is a lot of geotechnical work and surveys that go into the early siting process to kind of understand what the soil makeup looks like, and to make sure there aren't sort of risks in the construction process. And then something that I work on quite a bit is wildlife and habitat conflicts. So a lot of these projects are sited in sort of very rural open space areas where there are a lot of endangered species and habitat of concern. And so projects have to really be aware of those species and habitat concerns when they're looking at potential sites. And then finally, in that first bucket are cultural resources. I hope Maini will sort of dive into that a little bit more, but that is another piece of the sort of desktop analysis that developers are doing at the very beginning of the siting process. And then beyond physical characteristics, there are sort of the market realities bucket, I can call it. So certainly when we're talking about private land, both land availability and land price is one of the first kind of factors that developers have to kind of untangle. If you don't have enough land to make your project pencil, you can't even get started. There's a lot of negotiation that happens with landowners, of course, at that stage as well. And then, maybe the last thing I'll say, and maybe even most importantly, is the existence of transmission and reasonable interconnection costs that are close to your project. So typically, I think I see projects sited, anywhere from a couple feet to maybe 20 miles from a transmission line. There are projects that have been built further away. I would say those are more expensive and somewhat rare. So looking into both transmission capacity and location is absolutely critical when you're thinking about siting a project. And I would say is a place that I see a lot of our stakeholders in the environmental community and the conservation community still sort of understanding and wrapping their heads around that this really, the need to be near transmission significantly narrows the availability of land for solar projects. And then maybe I'll just touch really quickly on kind of the permitting process, which goes hand in hand with siting and where I kind of interface with the federal government. So there's both public and private land. The permitting process looks a little bit different when you talk about public versus private land. A lot of the public land in this country is owned by the Bureau of Land Management. It's a federal agency that owns, I think it's like 90% or upwards of our public lands. The BLM has a lengthy application process to lease public land for solar development. I could talk for an hour about what that is. I will not bore you all. But generally, when you are working with the BLM on a right-of-way, there's sort of a myriad of time-consuming and complex, federal laws that you have to comply with, both NEPA, endangered species, and then the National Historic Preservation Act as well. As projects, we're talking about community engagement, and so as projects kind of go through that environmental NEPA review, there are requirements for community engagement and stakeholder engagement wrapped into those regulations. So that is where a lot of the public engagement happens on public land. And then I will talk about private land, then I'll stop talking. So on private land, really the first kind of, like I said at the beginning, consideration is land control and availability. There is a lot more work kind of done at the front on private land to determine ownership of suitable land, to find willing landowners who have site control and where there are kind of enough parcels that can be pieced together to piece together a financiable project. On private land, there's much more state and local regulations that have to be complied with, so dealing less with kind of federal regulations and more with state and local folks, and those are going to vary very greatly from state to state. So it's something that you have to be very aware of as you kind of develop across different states. I'll stop there.
Great. Well, yeah, speaking of developing across different states and BLM, they just issued a new Western Solar Plan that's going to open up a whole lot of public land in 6 different states in a lot of the areas that Maini works closely with, right? And I know that Sovereign Energy was a big advocate for making sure that tribal communities were heard in that process. Could you tell us a little bit more about Western Solar Plan and why it's important?
Sure, and happy to expand a little bit more on what we mean by cultural resources. So Native people hold living and historical relationships to our land since time immemorial, and ongoing through pilgrimage, song, prayer, preservation efforts. So when we're talking about cultural resource protection, we're looking at that living relationship with the land. We're making sure that we are preserving sacred sites that have sustained us since our inception. And we really want to make sure that we're supportive of tribal energy sovereignty, but also making sure that we're supportive of infrastructure. And it's a really hard line and very difficult to navigate, making sure that we are meeting these huge climate goals that we need to, expanding infrastructure as much as we need to, but also in a way that really honors our tribal nations and make sure that we're being respectful of the land and water. So we're trying to figure out how we can support that and how to navigate that. Obviously, we have really huge climate goals to meet if we're going to, try to stay within any of our planetary boundaries at this point. And that requires mass amounts of land, which also does really impact our cultural resources. Sunzia is a really great example that is in the headlines all the time of just cultural resource consultation probably gone wrong, or just issues along the way. But when it comes to just meeting all of these thresholds, growing infrastructure, the BLM Western Solar Plan is a really great case study of just how to make sure that we're doing this work correctly. There you want to open up again mass amounts of public land, which triggers different environmental land stewardship laws, and including as NEPA, Endangered Species Act, the National Historic Preservation Act, Section 106 process. But really making sure that we're looking at where where these projects will go. So making sure again also that the government, in respect to tribal sovereignty and the government-to-government relationship between federal nations and tribal nations, is doing consultation correctly. So as a nonprofit, what we do is actually kind of bridge those relationships to the best of our ability. One of the big issues that we have within our Native communities is that there's just so much to do. Tribal historic preservation offices, TIPOs is what we call them, they have a stack of consultation requests on their desks all the time. So we really need to make sure that as an organization, we help support them. So we help navigate, kind of synthesize, analyze all of the different data, all of the different requests on their behalf to make sure that they're involved, and also just aware of what's going on so that we're not one, kind of blindsided by any development. Two, that we're not having to do expensive litigation later on. And three, that we are also supporting renewable energy infrastructure. So with the BLM Western Solar Plan, we've been working with tribes and pueblos across New Mexico specifically for the last several months, just giving them information, making sure that they're up to date, and also providing even draft comments for them to be able to file. Also really formalizing what the consultation process will look like. There's a lot, even within our federal agencies, a lot of direction that is just needed, or those bridges again to be built, and make sure that we're supporting our tribes. So right now, we're trying to figure out, just how to continue to navigate this work to make sure that we're an organization that really is seen as trustworthy by tribes, but also that we're not in the way of renewable energy in solar projects. We're just trying to actually make them move faster. But obviously, there's a lot of work to be done, and we'll touch more about best practices on public lands, private lands, and all of that later on.
Great. And yeah, building on that, David, your organization is really at the forefront of looking at best practices, and an example of the federal government exploring and using new resources and funding efforts to make sure that the stakeholder engagement process is effective and actually getting the job done. Can you tell us a little bit more about how SI2 is involved in that?
Yeah, sure. So the Department of Energy is funded us to really look at community engagement strategies and do rigorous social science research to actually understand sort of what works in the community engagement space. There's a lot of anecdotal stories from companies and from organizations about their community engagement activities, and some stories, or some companies tell success stories, but there's not a lot of actual evidence about strategies that actually will move the needle on public sentiment and will actually encourage community leaders to be more receptive to large-scale solar projects. So what we're doing is beginning to identify sites where we can test what we're calling innovative community engagement strategies across the country. There's 6 to 9 sites that we will identify, and then we intend to do rigorous social science research in those communities, so before, during, and after these community engagement strategies are being deployed. And I think it's going to tell us a lot. I think we will learn a lot about community preferences, about the ways that you engage different communities across the country, because there's a fair amount of regional variation about local custom and how you engage with folks, and so we'll learn a lot there. And it's an exciting project, and it's a 3.5-year effort, so this is not a small research project, but it should tell us a lot about what works in the community engagement space and give us that evidence to move the needle and reach our climate goals, as you were saying.
And this is kind of an effort to formalize the Solar Uncommon Dialogue program that you've had ongoing for a little while now. Could you tell us a little bit more about kind of the inception of that?
Yeah, the Solar Uncommon Dialogue, and Maren can add to this too, she's been involved in these discussions, began several years ago when conservation groups, stakeholders, non-governmental organizations that care about our climate goals but also care about our conservation resources, and some solar industry folks got together and said, you know what, we need better tools. We need to have tough conversations about what works for both sides of this, and how are we going to preserve our public lands or private lands, and how can we reach our renewable energy goals. So those groups all came together. They reached an agreement, 21 organizations reached an agreement in October of 2023 that mapped out a whole series of work streams to kind of work through all the different issues that are associated with siting and permitting. Maren kind of ticked through what some of those issues are at the top of the podcast here. But in the context of our grant, the Uncommon Dialogue is going to help us identify those innovative community engagement strategies that we can use. So it's really on the shoulders of a couple of working groups to come up with some strategies, and then we're going to take those strategies and do that testing in the field.
Yeah, and maybe I'll just piggyback a little bit off that on the Uncommon Dialogue. I think it's something I'm really excited about in the siting and permitting space. When I think about challenges with siting and permitting, one of just the most basic problems that developers face, I think, and stakeholders in general, is having the right people in the room at the right time. So a lot of times we're operating in these silos. There may be a few folks from the development community and the conservation community speaking, but we're just not gathering sort of all of the people that have an interest in siting. And these issues are hard. They're complicated. These are lands that have high value to a lot of people. And so one of the things that the Uncommon Dialogue does is works really hard to bring all of those stakeholders together into a conversation that is months, maybe years long, to really kind of untangle and just discuss things, as basic as, what does cultural resources mean? Like, what is the definition of cultural resources? To actually developing a site assessment framework for best practices in siting, and to really take into account all of the challenges we face. So I think, there are a lot of really thorny challenges with siting, but having the correct people in the room to discuss them shouldn't be a barrier that we cannot overcome. So I think the Uncommon Dialogue does a really good job of just bringing everyone together that has an interest in siting, and just having those tough conversations and kind of finding common ground where it is available. So it's in the early stages. We've just kind of launched some of those work streams that Dave, you mentioned. And I think it'll take, a good amount of time, but it's something I'm excited about in the siting space.
I should mention too that the co-convening organizations are Stanford, the Nature Conservancy, SIA, and then the Solar and Storage Industries Institute is involved as well. So those organizations sort of led the way, and now there's more than 60 organizations that are involved in these different work streams. So bringing a lot of folks to the table, and it's going to be really interesting to see what they produce.
Lots of stakeholders.
A lot of stakeholders.
Yeah. Uh, as we study and really try to make an evidence-based approach to stakeholder engagement, we obviously, have an idea of what some of those strategies and best practices might be. Mayani, could you talk to us a little bit more about, what are some best practices that project developers should really make sure they're kind of ticking that box as they, develop projects?
Sure. There's quite a bit to do, honestly. So, starting from the very beginning, from a project's inception, it's really critical to conduct outreach and engagement with tribes. When we talk about consultation, there's kind of like the big C consultation, which is government to government. But I think more often than not, we see many developers not doing their own outreach with tribes. And this is for projects not just on tribal lands, but off tribal lands as well. For any tribes that hold ancestral connection to the landscape. So all I can say is, as soon as you think a project might go somewhere, start reaching out. I think there's a number of ways to do it. Tribes are so inundated by different companies that it's really important to make sure that you're also trying to build trust within the community, and that can be done through different ways. But one thing I always recommend too is just maybe hire a tribal liaison and have Native people on staff to help advise internally. It's really critical that it's done in an authentic way. Tribes have been so hurt by the energy industry for centuries now that there's a lot of hesitancy to why should we listen? How can we trust them? They don't look like us. They show up in their very flashy suits, fancy cars, but they don't have any stake in this. So why should we listen to them? So really trying to do that own internal work. And then I also recommend, when you are doing a project, if there is ancestral connection, kind of see what the tribes say, but really recommend having cultural resource surveying and tribal monitors who are designated by the tribes, to trusted people within their own communities or consultants that they work with to help do their own monitoring work. One thing that I think, working with developers in my past and also working on the side of tribes is also just kind of the miscommunications, or also just kind of the lack of information. And what I'm specifically pointing to here is sometimes, if tribes are doing their own monitoring work, they're not going to disclose what they find. And that's just something that you have to be comfortable with. It's really, really difficult. We're very tribal people, Native people, we're very private about our cultural resource. You can't really go asking why too much. So, that's just something to know and kind of build that own awareness of, and really understand the boundaries there. That's also something that's kind of, the ongoing battle that tribes have even with the federal government is, we don't want to disclose that. So as a company, what I recommend kind of to synthesize everything is, just one, make sure you're doing early outreach, try to build out tribal liaisons, do even cultural sensitivity training. So, understanding what, what tribal sovereignty means. Another thing I always say is a really easy way to piss off a tribe is to not understand their sovereign status. Make sure you really, understand what that means and what their nationhood means. But again, making sure that you have those people on staff, those advisors, do cultural sensitivity and competency training, and then make sure that you do have those tribal monitors when you start building out those projects, making sure that there is, ongoing engagement. Engagement doesn't just mean one letter, it means, consistent efforts, consistent feedback from the project's inception until operation, and making sure that there's just ongoing dialogue there. And there's a number, of different organizations. We're happy to help with some advising roles, but I think it's really just making sure that you're doing the due diligence internally. And, tribes do remember who's wronged them. There's so many, we have a good list of, companies that, have really not done and approached tribes respectfully. And making sure that you're, doing that hard work beforehand. But ultimately, it does pay off. Like I mentioned earlier, doing it the right way kind of prevents all of that expensive litigation later on. It helps the success of the project. And tribes are honestly, probably more often than not very willing and very excited to engage in it, to figure out even if they could be owners and operators of a project, to help host it, different ways that they could also help meet their own goals their own revenue streams, their own community, whatever their community priorities are. But yeah, I think the main thing is just, again, early outreach, consistent outreach, and just kind of doing that own, the own step, like internal steps to make sure that you're kind of prepared to do so.
Yeah, just building on that a little bit. I mean, that's what you just ticked through is exactly what the research sort of tells us to date. Lawrence Berkeley National Lab has done a bunch of survey research on this topic, like who's the best messenger for community engagement strategies. And guess what? It's not the federal government, it's not state government officials, it's not the solar industry, it's community groups, representatives from the community themselves that are the best messengers. So it's all consistent with the academic literature on this entire subject across the country, and it just speaks to this need that your organization is providing, because the federal government is not a trusted resource for this kind of stuff. So kudos to you and your group for plugging that gap, because that's a critical portion of this going forward.
Sorry, I just wanted to ask a quick follow-up question. You mentioned tribes becoming owners and operators, and I just wonder if you could talk a little bit more about that and kind of what the challenges may be. Are there things that might help tribes be owners and operators? Is it access to capital? Is it better partnership? Is it technical assistance? Like, what are some of the sort of progress that needs to be made there?
Yeah, we could be here all day, and I'll try to keep it brief. So many tribes do want to own and operate projects, and I'll kind of backtrack a little bit to what tribal sovereignty means to us. And there's just a quick history lesson. There's 574 federally recognized tribes in the United States. Each has its own sovereign status. Each tribe has its own cultural values, its own priorities, its own energy priorities. So when we say tribal energy sovereignty, it's really a unique definition to each tribe of what they want to do. So that could be owning and operating a project. More and more we're seeing tribes do want to own and operate projects. They want to build their own wealth, their own capital. And I think it's also just the distrust of past experiences, particularly with leasing. We hear horror stories of a tribe getting $50 a year for a right-of-way. That contract still goes 30 more years. That's not uncommon. So I think there's more and more drive to own and operate projects, but there are different barriers to entry. For certain tribes, for instance, we might not have the capital to be able to put up to be an owner-operator. Lenders might look at tribes as being too risky. Tribes may not want to waive any sovereign immunity, so there's a lot of barriers there. And then also just making sure that, looking at the risk tolerance even within the own community. So for instance, we work really closely with tribes on community solar projects, and what is owning and operating a project there? I mean, it also means, being on the line in case it's not functioning at full capacity, and what the tribe is going to do. Because if it's not running, they're not getting any money. Their net metering isn't running, it's kind of just sitting there. So what do they do in that circumstance? So it's really kind of asking, even working internally with the tribe, of what owning and operating a project means and what they're able to do. But yeah, there's a number of different barriers. I think the IRA, VIL has helped it for sure. We don't need a tax equity partner like we did in the past. But there's still, just different considerations where having a third-party owner might make more sense. But again, it comes back to the tribe. It comes back to per project. It comes back to their historic experiences with energy.
And David, is the funding for the studies that you are doing, is that coming from the IRA?
I think it's actually coming from the infrastructure law. It's not specific IRA funding, but it's from the bipartisan infrastructure law that was passed right before that. So,
cool.
Yeah.
And so, returning to one of the clear best practices that you all are describing is having it be from the inception of the idea of the project, stakeholder engagement. And one area that we're seeing that is Chuckwalla National Monument, and how that is a goal for tribal communities, and then also the balancing of that with renewable energy development. Maren, could you talk to us a little bit about what that process has looked like?
Yeah, and Mine, I wonder if you want to kind of describe what the National Monument is. Just, I don't want, it's It's probably more in your wheelhouse, and then I can kind of talk about the lessons we've learned there.
I think you should go for
Okay,
it. Yeah.
I'm happy to do it. So Chuckwalla is a proposed national monument in the Mojave Desert. It's been proposed. It has not been passed. National monuments can go through a couple different channels. The president can sign an executive order through the Antiquities Act that would designate a national monument, or Congress can pass legislation. So Chuckwalla is a really interesting case study, I would say, as Jacob kind of alluded to, because it is located on sort of sensitive lands for both environmental reasons as well as travel reasons, and it also happens to be along the I-10 corridor, which is a major transmission corridor that will serve some of the major load centers in the west, and so that land that's proposed as a national monument is sort of prime, sort of developable land for solar projects. So there are a lot of different kind of stakeholders that have an interest in this land. And when Chuckwalla was proposed, I think we learned a lot of sort of good lessons about the importance of early stakeholder engagement and the importance of having, like I alluded to earlier, just kind of the correct people in the room speaking to each other from the very beginning of a project. When the monument was proposed, this was probably back in the spring at some point that it became public, the developer community was concerned because they felt like they had not been, consulted or sort of brought into some of the discussions on where the boundaries of the monument would be. There were several proposed solar projects that would fall within the boundaries of the monument. Once the monument has been designated, that land is off the table forever for solar development. So through some really sort of lengthy discussions, a lot of stakeholders were kind of brought in, and I think a lot of these sort of issues with the boundary were resolved. But I bring this up just to say that the monument still has not been approved, and I think part of that reason, there's a lot of political reasons as well that we don't need to get into, but I think part of that reason is because there was a lot of conflict over where the boundary should fall and where sort of tribal resources needed to be protected versus where solar projects need to go to connect to transmission. And so if those conversations had kind of happened, I think, earlier in the process, a lot of that conflict probably could have been avoided. A resolution, which I think we are getting to, but that could have happened a lot earlier and sort of maybe not stalled the designation of the monument. So I think there's still a lot of work to be done, but I think it's a good example of why stakeholder engagement needs to happen from really, as you mentioned, the inception of the project.
Another best practice that I think has been talked about before is the idea of community benefit agreements. David, is that something that you all are looking at SI2?
Yeah, it is, and there's a lot of different flavors of this. Community benefit agreements should be very specific to tailored to community needs, right? Like, I think we are beyond the stage where just solar companies could make a payment to a local government for their general purposes. We need to have agreements that are much more designed to meet community needs. So that's a big piece of the work that we're going to be doing at the Institute going forward. The other thing too about community benefit agreements that has become increasingly clear is that companies can negotiate these agreements during the development stage, but they have to honor the agreements, right? So, and a lot of folks don't appreciate that in the solar project development space, there could be multiple companies that will own a project during the course of its lifetime. So the developer will hand it off to the building contractor to actually install the project, and then the long-term asset owner. And what we've seen a lot in some of the work that we've already done is that some of these community benefit agreements get lost along the way. So they need to be sticky, is the way I put it, and be tied to the project over the long term, so that the community does see the benefit that's negotiated up front. And that kind of gets back to some of the issues that Mayani was raising about how you want to build trust in a community, or if you want to destroy trust in a community, a developer makes an agreement and then it doesn't get followed through on at the end of the process. So Lots of work to do there.
And what are some other components that would comprise a good community benefit agreement? It's a pretty broad question. But.
Well, starting with utility scale or transmission, from a native community perspective, more often than not, that energy is exported from native lands, and especially utility transmission scale where you can't really tap into it, or it's going to the broader grid, or Navajo Nation, for instance, has 15% of its homes who are still without electricity, yet a huge hub for all eyes are on Navajo Nation to do solar energy, and where is that energy going to go? To APS, to California, to PNM, so I think that's a really hard conversation to have, especially when community members are, why should we give you our land? Why should you develop there when we don't even have electricity? So really looking at the needs within the community, but also especially for, how distributed generation could somehow be configured within community benefits plans for those utility scale and transmission projects. And making sure that community members actually stand to benefit, especially for those who are directly adjacent to these projects whose lands they can't tap into it. They really don't have much to gain, and there will be a lot of pushback. So I think a way to figure out in that circumstance, like off-grid systems, other distributed generation, and then I think there's just a number of different elements that community benefits plans can have that could be more community derived. I think having a cookie cutter approach is really difficult and kind of isn't really adept to what the community needs. So having that ongoing community engagement, which I'm sure you can share more best practices about, and making sure that it's really highlighting what the priorities are. Versus coming in and having something that worked in Chicago and trying to do that within a native community in Arizona.
It's not going to work. I mean, you touched on something else too that's kind of interesting. There's the disconnect between a solar project that's injecting power into the large-scale grid, and the community members don't see the benefit of that. New York State has experimented with a bill credit that can be applied to the neighbors of the project. So what they've tried to do is share the benefits of the injections of the large-scale solar facility with the community itself, so they can see actually a real tangible electric credit that will offset some of their cost. And I think that's a really innovative strategy. At the time when I last looked at this, there were projects that New York hadn't applied those credits just yet. They were still working out some of the details for that. But it does strike me as an interesting model to pursue across the country, because you really do want that connection to the power that's being hosted on either sovereign lands or public or private lands as well.
So what other states are doing interesting things and policy developments related to stakeholder engagement and making sure that communities benefit from the projects that are happening in those communities?
Well, I'll grab one example and then I'll turn it over to the panelists too. I mean, this isn't particularly a state approach, but in the offshore wind space, there's been a fair amount of experimenting with peer-to-peer interactions for local permitting officials or state officials. So, for example, there's a fair amount of offshore wind development that's happening in Massachusetts right now, and towns that are hosting either port sites or they are part of the supply chain to actually build the facility. Those companies have convened local officials from Massachusetts with folks in California so they can learn lessons from each other. So the experience on the ground in Massachusetts is being translated over to some of the California discussions, and it's been really productive. And that's one of the things that we actually want to test in our research, to say, look, going back to the messenger thing again, well, if the federal government and solar companies aren't the best messengers, well, maybe another good set of messengers might actually be the local officials themselves, who have seen the development on site and have a real perspective about how the large-scale solar project or whatever kind of clean energy project it is has impacted their community.
So I guess I'd add, maybe this is a little bit tangential, but I mentioned in my intro that I work primarily kind of in the environmental and conservation space. So one of the things that I think is kind of exciting in the siting space is mitigation strategies that developers are sort of innovating and implementing to really mitigate against utility scale siting impacts from an environmental standpoint. So these are both kind of species impacts as well as water impacts or other things of that nature. There's a lot of kind of exciting things being tested out in the field. There's some really simple, innovative strategies with fencing, with wildlife corridors, and sort of other ways that you can build a project in a modular way to mitigate against some environmental impacts of siting. Didn't really answer your question, but I wanted to just kind of get the environmental aspect in there as well.
Can you dive into those mitigation strategies a little more?
Yeah, so I mean, I think from a siting perspective, the first place to go is really avoidance. There's kind of a three-step process that developers try to follow, and the first step is avoid if possible. So if you run into species concerns, maybe there's a water concern or some other kind of environmental concern, I think if you can avoid that, do it as much as possible. And there's also a benefit on the developer side as well, because they won't get tangled up in some of the kind of environmental regulations like NEPA and ESA that may really slow down a project. If avoidance is not possible, then I think you would move to mitigation. I think we talked about the Western Solar Plan. I think there's a lot of discussion there about how to mitigate some impacts in the Western states. And there's a lot of really cool examples out there. I think invite you to our website. There's a lot of material on there. And I think most of the ones that I sort of work on closely have to do with wildlife. So really just citing a project so that and doing the kind of work up front with desktop analysis and other kind of federal agencies like Fish and Wildlife to really understand where these species are migrating, which pieces of land are really important for their survival, and then building a project in kind of maybe a modular way and allowing for wildlife to still progress through that project. There's also, we haven't touched on ecosystem services and agrivoltaics, and so there's a lot of ways that I think there's a lot of sessions here at the conference that have talked more about this, but developing projects that are sort of more in harmony with the land, I would say, so that you're not just sort of bulldozing a site, you're really building it to be sort of in existence with the land and being kind of a benefit to the environment rather than a hazard. So those are just some examples.
As a comms guy, there's nothing better than sheep next to solar panels. Love it. Can you share an example of just stakeholder engagement done right? You talked a little bit about the Western Solar Plan, but wondering if there are specific projects that kind of come to mind when you think of deliberate and thoughtful stakeholder engagement that really made the project much more successful than it could have been otherwise.
I think it's really revealing of how much we need to change practices when it's really hard to think of one that has been done right. I think there's some underway, and due to the confidentiality that we hold with the tribes, I can't share too much about. But having that early onset engagement has made a significant difference. I think one thing though that, again, pointing back to the best practices mentioned earlier, is to make sure that developers are really aware of the differing timelines. So I think more often than not, developers will have, they have the COD date, they want to be able to have, a project completed within, this time frame. And that often won't happen. So I think that's something where we see a lot of frustration working with tribes. But in terms of it being done right, there are a number of companies, again, who have started hiring more native staff, who have done more, their own capacity building, which is really helpful. But yeah, it's a lot of the status quo needs to be changed, unfortunately.
I wonder if maybe a follow-up question to you is there sort of anything written down or memorialized that would be sort of a model for tribal partnership. So something that could be replicated from project to project. You mentioned there aren't a lot of good examples, but maybe as those are developed, really sort of developing guidelines for sort of best practices for working with tribes. Is that something that would be helpful? Is that something you're thinking about or working on?
Yeah, so I mean, there is, we do need to start building out kind of a model, like you mentioned. It's hard because there is nothing that's really replicable across, again, all of the tribes or all of the different state policies. But there are better examples, I think, now of, think really cool ways that tribes have benefited from projects. One actually here in California with the Morongo Band of Mission Indians, really interesting case study of Morongo owning a transmission line. But again, that had a number of different components and pieces that made that possible, and it's not something that's necessarily we're able to replicate in other places. That could be, that one specifically was due to just the location, the cost of placing it elsewhere, Morongo Band being able to finance it and put money forward. So there's a lot of differing issues that really make it difficult, again, to not kind of do the case-by-case basis. But there are best practices. I think one thing too that's really difficult is where each state also has its own relationship and consultation processes with the tribes. So New Mexico is my home state. We have the New Mexico State Tribal Collaboration Act. In terms of the state conducting consultation with tribes, we're probably at the forefront and one of the better states. But many, there's again a wide spectrum of what that consultation looks like, what the state agencies and departments take on. So it's just very difficult, working with the Indian country, unfortunately.
Well, there's one hypothesis that we have at the Institute about community engagement that we're kind of eager to test too, which is, ultimately community members want to feel like their views are affecting project design, right? They want to feel like they're having an impact on the final product that's actually being, that would be constructed. And to the extent to which, I think to date, there hasn't been a whole lot of negotiation over the configurations of sites, over the kind of vegetative screenings around sites, or sort of the location of particular sites with respect to other community buildings, that kind of thing. I think it would be really interesting to see to what extent a developer changes the project design and the configuration of a large-scale system to be responsive to community needs, because ultimately, people want to feel like they're being heard. And so if a developer can do that, that would be a really interesting to test that and understand sort of how much that builds community support or at least tamps down local opposition.
Great. Well, we're nearing the end of our time here. So it would be great if we could close with, I would love to hear just, what you all are most excited about that's coming down the line and the future of land use and stakeholder engagement.
You want to go first?
No.
I mean, I think I already mentioned this, but I think the Uncommon Dialogue is really a bright spot in the siting space. As I said, apologies to those of you who have been here since the beginning, because I'm going to repeat myself, but really brings together the conservation community, the tribal community, the developers, the EPCs, really all of the folks that have an interest in utility scale siting, and is taking the time to have really in-depth conversations together and untangling some really thorny issues. I think that's something that has not been done on this scale before, and I hope that we can develop some deliverables and outputs that are really replicable in the siting space. So that's what I'm excited about.
Well, my answer is going to be super nerdy, as you would expect. Evidence. I think we don't have the evidence of actually what works on community engagement. And I think our project will help build some of the evidence that will help tailor community engagement strategies across the country. It's desperately needed, so that's what I'm excited about, building the record.
I'm excited that it's only going to be better from here. So I think Native people, we've been through the worst of it, honestly. So it really, there's so much room for improvement, but it's looking up. We've been through the side of nuclear testing. We have open mines and mills out still. We still have open oil gas wells. Like it's just, how much worse could it really get? So I think it's also kind of, unfortunately, looking at it through that lens is that there's a lot of room for improvement. I think there's a lot of drive for improvement too. It's really amazing to see so many companies wanting to work with tribes, to be open and receptive to feedback. And I think that's honestly something that we haven't had before. It is a relatively new practice. So just, again, also want to make it, I don't want to tip the tone to think that, don't work with tribes, because ultimately we want that. We want to be involved. We want to be hosting these projects. We want to be owning and operating them. We want to help, we've been climate leaders since, again, time immemorial. We see, the impacts of climate change and we feel them first, especially as Native communities. So I don't want it to detour any of you from, working with tribes. Again, happy to help. There's a number of organizations. There's a number of, tribally led organizations that can help, assist or think through some of these practices and make sure that you're doing your outreach in a really authentic way. So yeah, it's very hopeful, but it's also, making sure that we're being mindful of the paradigm and that we're changing it.
Awesome. Well, Mayani, Marin, David, thank you so much for joining me. Thank you to Suncast Media, and thanks for coming to the PowerUp live stage presented by Wardzilla Energy Optimization and Storage. So thanks, folks. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Welcome back to the PowerUp Live stage. We are live once again. My name is Nico Johnson. I see a lot of my friends out in the audience. Hey, if you want to, all right. Hey, if you want to hear a little bit better, if the din of the noise here is a little too much for you, my friend holding the headphones up right here, Ryan Smith, will hook you up. These headphones are magic because they'll help you tune into our conversation so you can tune out of all the other noise. I'd love for you to come back down here and give me a big hug when you get a chance. You know who you are if you saw me waving at you. We're going to talk about energy and how it gets deployed at a rapid scale with one of the top EPCs in the country. And I say energy because Burns McDonnell is known for EPC across the energy landscape. You guys have rapidly become one of the top 5 solar and storage integrators here in the United States market. So the PowerUp Live stage is brought to you, by the way, by Wärtsilä Energy Storage and Optimization. We have a lovely cast of sponsors as well: ABC Supply, FLO, Fluence, MGM Transformers, and TrueGrid. Thank you so much to those companies for helping make this stage possible. We love having these kinds of conversations with folks who are actually on the front lines of the energy transition. So we're going to talk about what it looks like, not just to talk at a high level about how batteries work or how trackers or modules are evolving, but really when the rubber meets the road, when the actual equipment hits the ground, the people that are putting it together, how are they making it work? Adam Bernardi and Grant Reeser from Burns McDonnell are going to give us a look behind the veil, as I mentioned, of the top 5 EPC, their vision for optimizing large-scale solar projects. We're going to explore the current state of the module market, including updates on domestic content and the strategies that are helping their customers to deploy more solar and take advantage of the IRA credits. You know, optimization around these site conditions takes perspective of the different terrain. We have now practically every tracker has terrain following equipment, different equipment combinations to try to meet IRA requirements. And Burns McDonnell and their team take all of this into consideration when they're guiding their customers through this process. We're also going to discuss things like handling challenging performance testing in the frozen tundra of the upper Midwest. And this is an all-encompassing look at the critical role that your EPC partner plays in the success of your project. Adam and Grant, welcome to the show.
Oh, thank you so much for having us. It's a pleasure to be here.
Absolutely. I don't know if my mic can come up as good as Adam's is, but I feel like I have to yell, and he's got like such a projecting voice.
I just need to be a little quieter, maybe.
All right. So I wanted to get a perspective. You know, I feel like there's probably folks that are very aware, obviously, as a top 5 EPC, of who Burns McDonnell is. But talk about a little bit about the heritage of Burns McDonnell as a construction company, if you will.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're headquartered in Kansas City, Missouri, but we have large offices across the country. I sit in Kansas City. Grant sits in our Phoenix office. You know, most people who have known Burns & Mac for the 100+ years that we've been in business, we were an engineering firm to start, and then had the opportunity to bolt on self-performed construction about 7 years ago. And the addition of the self-perform aspect is really what propelled us into the EPC market. For those of us who live and breathe in this space every day, we know that for us to be successful, we have to control critical parts of the work, and that's really through self-perform.
Yeah.
So we don't self-perform everything. We still have subcontract partners that are very important to us, but it's really kind of our engineering heritage that we feel like separates us and really sets us apart from some of our competitors.
Yeah, amazing. So we're going to talk a bit more about the decisions that developers and asset owners rely on the EPC partner to help them make. And a lot of this comes down to how do you take into consideration all the things from trade policy to AD/CVD, IRA. There's so much that impacts the project economics. Could you just sort of separate the wheat from the shaft right out of the gate, Adam, on the module market in particular, what you're seeing in the module market and how all these different levers really impact the project economics?
Yeah, so you know, we got some additional clarity on domestic content probably a few months ago, and that is really kind of the big trend that we're hearing about, right? So you know, modules is not something that an EPC contractor buys very often anymore, right? So our role in it is really kind of trying to understand what their end goals are. And Grant and team do a fantastic job of that, right? Where it's not just about building a project, it's really trying to understand the end goals of the customer. You mentioned domestic content. Now with domestic content, we're seeing some folks ask questions about, how do you thread the needle between getting enough domestic content modules to kind of check the box to get that additional 10%, and then maybe there is some other modules that are, not domestically supplied, and trying to optimize around that solution.
So what you're saying is there is a way to basically take a techno-economic approach to choosing modules that perhaps are half or some percentage not subject to AD/CVD, and trying to find an economic price point that still meets the project economics.
We're getting questions about that,
Okay.
right? And so, Grant, I'd love to hear your perspective, because this is really what his team do so well, right? Because we don't buy the modules, it's really the owners coming to us, and it's almost sometimes like bring me a rock, right? Grant can tell you how many different times we do layouts for projects, right? We never get it right on the first time because the owner changes something, or they ask a different question, or Grant and team find, just a little something that can get a little more juice out of the project.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's really important for us to understand a little bit, behind the scenes of what is driving the owner's pro forma in that project. And so instead of just getting a direction, we want a 250 megawatt project, period, in this land. Like, that's great, we can do that. But what we really like to understand is the owner's, is it a net capacity factor? Is it a certain year one energy target? And then we can really pull in the module selection, equipment selection based on that target, and kind of, as he said, build a better mousetrap.
Yeah, I love the techno-economic solution. We're going to have to borrow that, because that's really a perfect description for what Grant and team do.
Yeah, I love that. So Grant, I know that you guys also spend a lot of time thinking about the fact that we no longer have these perfect postage stamp sites. No more taking the most easy to grab, Bureau of Land Management sites, or big open farm fields. It feels like every single tracker manufacturer at some point in the last 18 months has issued a mandate to their design team. We have to have a terrain following product. How do you all evaluate terrain following trackers and the benefits into your projects?
Yeah, so there's obviously cost impacts to mitigating grading, earthwork, seeding, site restoration, but what we found is there's also counties or owners that have a certain amount of earthwork that they've committed to the community or to the landowner that they're going to do. So it may only be 5 to 10% of the site that they've agreed to grading. So in some instances, it's not necessarily the cost, but it's the commitments to the community and to the county that we have to take into consideration when we evaluate terrain following or not.
That is fascinating. And it also impacts not only the commitments that are made to the municipality, but if you can terrain follow, you do have an impact on the actual yield of the project, right? So there's a trade-off there in terms of whether or not you're able to harvest the maximum amount of energy. Yeah.
Yep.
What about, you mentioned in the lead-up this concept of self-perform. I know that you guys have the ability for self-perform, both union and I presume non-union capabilities as well. How do you decide on a project-by-project basis whether or not you'll self-perform versus subcontract?
Yeah, so for us, there's a lot of things that go into it. The first of which is the area of the country that we're working in, and then how busy we are on the self-perform side. So for us, mechanical installation, so that's the driving of pile, the assembly of the tracker, that is almost a no-brainer for us, right? That is one of the most critical aspects of the job that we will always self-perform. It gives us a great amount of control to kind of get out ahead. When we look at electrical, that's when we start to have some questions internally. How busy are we? We have some really good subcontract partners who do nothing but electrical install. So depending on how much work we have on the books, it's a really good way for us to take on another project, bring on a partner that we trust, that we've worked with before, and know that we can be successful. And then as it relates to civil, that is always a subcontract partner for Burns & McDonnell. Right now we don't own yellow iron equipment. I don't know that we'll get into that business, but we're fortunate to have a lot of great partners across the country who help us with that early site grading, depending on how much there is now with the terrain following trackers.
Grant, I know that you have the challenge of balancing your internal engineering capabilities with the growth requirements of Burns McDonnell moving into new markets. How much of the decision really relies on like existing markets versus new markets in terms of how you think about self-perform?
Yeah, I think a lot of the time where we are going into a new market, we weigh the pros and cons of having more control over the execution of the work is beneficial. However, we also acknowledge that there are local subcontractors which know that market better than us in some instances. And so a lot of those we pull from our other global practices or work that we do where we may have relationships outside of just solar with an electrical subcontractor in a given area. And then we may, utilize them and develop that partnership on the solar side. So pros and cons of both, but especially in new areas, there's often people who are more familiar with that market than we are. And so we take advantage of that.
And then on the union side of our business, it's not just the local union relationships, but kind of at the regional level and at the national level are just super important and critical for us to do business because they can help make introductions in other parts of the country, maybe where we haven't worked, to Grant's point. Maybe we haven't built solar there. Maybe we've built something out. But those union leaders, when we're going to execute union, are really important if we haven't done it to help us make those local connections. Because, we mentioned, it's important for us to be environmentally conscious when we're building these. We also like to participate in our communities. So, it's important for us to build those relationships. We try to get in early. We'll partner with the unions on not only making sure that we're going to get the apprentices that we need, that is obviously now super important with IRA, but we'll bring install manuals and we'll try and bring demo products so the craft can get their hands on it. And so when they're showing up at our job site, it's not the first time that they have seen it, right? They've had the opportunity to do some test runs, put their hands on it, and so we feel like we're ready for game time when we hit the field.
Amazing. So a lot of what we've been talking about is kind of what happens once the project moves into your hands and you start moving towards the completion cycle. But what about upstream? Because there's a critical decision that has to happen in the development phase of how they're going to tackle the EPC process altogether. And I know that it must be frustrating as you often receive this sort of baked project that's in the developer's mind is ready to roll. And it's not so baked. I want to talk a bit about the things that you commonly see in the development phase that when it's handed to you in the EPC phase, you really wish could have been more polished, or maybe they would have engaged with you sooner in the process.
Yeah, I mean, almost every project we see is shovel ready, right, at this stage of the game, right? No, I mean, I guess I will say the market has come a long way. Like the RFP packages and what we see today has improved drastically from probably what we've even seen 3 years ago, would you say?
Yep.
Some common things. One, it's hard to hold it against owners. We know as an EPC contractor, we're not alone. We all kind of have our persnickety requirements as it relates to geotech, right?
Yep.
Owners will tell you, for you guys, there's never enough geotech, right? So that is one thing that we tend to either want to go back and do, or we find that maybe isn't quite up to our standards. The other thing is, and maybe Grant can touch on this after I set it up, is on the layout side, right? I mean, he mentioned the techno-economic analysis that we go through. We get a lot of layouts from owners who maybe only want to pay for a 10% package, or maybe they have a little bit of in-house engineering and they haven't really thought through the constructability of a project, right? So for us, we would prefer just make sure the environmental constraints are done, have your wetlands formally delineated, make sure the cultural analysis is done, and then just give us that, and Grant and team will kind of take it from there.
Yeah, definitely. I think that owners, as Adam said, the past 2 to 3 years, it has definitely improved in the quality of the information we're getting. But, as I mentioned, getting the next level information around the energy targets and kind of the owner's goals allows us to really develop that layout and provide the best value to the client.
I feel like it's not uncommon that, and I brought this up in a conversation a couple of hours ago, as the EPC, you probably get the most conservative module pricing or equipment pricing possible, right? So I'm sure you have a lot to work with when you get the pricing packages and the equipment specifications. I'm, of course, speaking tongue-in-cheek. But how do you help accommodate for that request for pricing process?
It's a great question. Part of it is, that's why events like this are so important. The whole industry is here. It gives, we have 3 days to, kind of continue to build, maintain relationships with some of those suppliers. Not everybody builds everybody's products, so we tend to build more, maybe sometimes it's more ATI than Next Tracker or,
Yeah.
or fill in the blank. So those relationships are important because they can help speed the process up. I will say, much like we talked about the quality of the information, I think now there's an understanding that, like, you know, the amount of time that we have to put into a number kind of reflects the quality of the number and the amount of conservatism that we get. We're also seeing owners, I mean, we were having a discussion today about project CODs in 27 already.
Yeah.
So I think, you know, 25 is going to be a really big build year, almost filled up. 26, we're almost done, and we're already talking about 27. So that means owners are getting ahead of it and wanting to engage us earlier,
Yeah.
which is super helpful for Grant and team to start to see projects earlier. We can start to plan our workforce. We can have proactive discussions with OEMs about,
Yeah.
you know, their capacity to be able to deliver. What are they seeing in pricing? What do we think the price of steel is going to do? All of those things,
Yeah.
you know, if we can do them earlier is really the benefit to the owner at the end.
Grant, we talked, I kind of teed up at the beginning that not all projects are built in Arizona or Florida or Texas. Build a lot of stuff up in the upper Midwest, and it impacts the project timelines. I imagine that your owners are very forgiving of your project timelines as well, right? How do you manage expectations and the implications that, you know, foul weather can have on getting these projects turned on in time?
Yeah, I think in the upper Midwest, we definitely have the benefit of our self-reform capabilities are based in Appleton, Wisconsin.
Yeah.
So we have a lot of historical and boots-on-the-ground experience in the upper Midwest. And so when, a lot of the time when we get a schedule from the client, you know, first question in Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan is, are you going to work through the winter? Are you going to do reduced level of work in the winter?
Yep.
And obviously, one winter you could get 50 inches of snow, the next you could get 20, so kind of got to play it by ear. So as we're developing the schedule and the pricing, that's obviously a significant item. And then we also look ahead at commissioning of the plant and of performance testing, because obviously no one here can control the weather, and your ability to do performance testing is dependent on the weather. So we've actually been working with our owners in those regions to have an option or kind of a next stage for what referred to as an initial capacity test, where if you run into some limitations in November, December, January, you can kind of loosen the requirements a little bit and complete a test and then come back later in the spring and do a follow-up test. And so having that kind of foresight and option in the contract at the beginning is very beneficial, as opposed to scrambling in December, you know, trying to figure out what you're going to do to get through testing.
That's been an interesting discussion, specifically in MISO. I think, as I understand it, a lot of owners, you know, they have to submit like summertime for the capacity market.
Right.
And so if you hear what Grant said in terms of, you know, maybe we're, you know, best time is spring to summer to get ready for that from an owner's perspective, right, doesn't leave a lot of time. And so we've had these discussions because if you lay it out where we say, hey, we want to do this initial test to be able to give us some flexibility, owners automatically think, oh, well, you're just trying to get off the hook. And while we're not necessarily trying to get off the hook, we're trying to be supportive for them to get ready for that capacity planning for them for the summer. So it's something that we can do to be able to prove the plant works, right? We're not trying to get out of our requirements. Most of them are agreeable to kind of let us off the hook for LDs, but then the requirement to come back in the spring, do the full-blown performance testing for them so then they can be ready for the summer.
Amazing. Well, guys, I know that everyone is looking to add solar to their portfolios. It's what keeps your business thriving. Your ability to deliver on not just the timeliness, but the techno-economic performance of these assets, and from engineering all the way through to completion is what has elevated you to the top cream of the crop. So as a result, you must be receiving an outsized amount of requests for bid into projects. And I thought it would be good to wrap with both of your perspectives. What makes a project good or bad? And I know it's completely subjective. There's no objectivity here, but from your perspective, if you could just have a PSA to the developer and IPP world on behalf of all EPCs, how would you qualify and even maybe create some checklists for the kinds of projects that you want to bid into versus the ones that you're more likely to pass on.
Yeah, absolutely. So maybe I'll let Grant take the project side of it, because
Okay.
we always have some jokes internally at Burns and Mac about maybe it looks like a cheetah or a patchwork quilt in terms of how spread it is, how spread out it is. Some salespeople bring those in, and we nickname those projects after them.
That's funny.
So maybe I'll take the client side of it, right?
Okay.
Because the projects are important, but the people we do business with are equally important, right? Because if you have a strong relationship, if you're able to build trust with clients, right, you can get through a bad project, right? Commercially, we've done some different things that, most who live in this market, we know that this is a fixed price world at some point that we execute in, but there are some things, we see a lot of drain tile in the Midwest, and that can be, a big uncertainty about how we handle that. If you drive a post through it, right, you're not going to find out for a couple of days, but guess what? You're going to have a lake on your hands. So we're not perfect. We look for owners who understand that we're not perfect.
Yeah.
Like we always say, we like to know who we're doing business
Right.
with. So us responding to RFPs is generally not right how we're successful. It's more coming to events like this, making sure that we're interfacing with up and down. We understand how they make decisions.
Yeah.
So almost like kind of when you're dating, looking for a spouse. That's kind of how it feels when we're looking for people to do business with. 'Cause
Makes sense.
we don't want to do just one project, right? We want to do one project a year for the next 10 years and really build a strong relationship. So that's generally what I focus on, is kind of on the people side, the client side. Do they have the money? Do they have what the success and the reputation in the market? And then Grant and team focus on the technical and project size, and talk about the dead cats or the cheetahs that we bring in.
Yeah, I didn't expect Adam to bring up dating in his response to your question, but on the technical side, I mean, right, there's different perceptions of a good or a bad project, but what we like to see is a client that understands the risks or pros and cons of a given project. So sites will have drain tiles, sites will have wetlands, sites will have gas lines, but it's clients who understand the impacts of that, and to Adam's point earlier, provide that information up front or have already done some of that legwork to where you're not figuring it out, at 90% or IFC, and then you got to scramble. And so it's more the quality of the due diligence, and if you have a patchwork design, as Adam mentioned, different parcels, like do they have the easements in place? Do they have crossings identified, highways, gas lines, etc.? So we can overcome those challenges, but the earlier you identify them and get that level of information really helps us, drive the value into it, as opposed to, playing from behind and trying to resolve it at the IFC stage.
Fascinating. I love this discussion. I'm really grateful to have an opportunity to really dig deep. I don't often get a chance to just ask a ton of questions from someone who is actually actively out building this energy transition and doing it at the level that Burns & McDonnell is, the pedigree, the heritage from the oil and gas days. It's great to see a company that has really been able to train their focus on being an energy transition contractor and not leaning on the legacy business, but really leaning into where the energy business is going. Adam Bernardi is Director of Solar. Grant Reeser is Associate Electronical Engineer at Burns & McDonnell, a top 5 solar and storage EPC in the space. Thank you guys for taking time to come to the PowerUp Live stage and enlighten us.
Yeah, thank you for having us.
Yeah, thanks, Nico. It's always a pleasure.
And thank you all for tuning in. This is a conversation happening live at the PowerUp Live stage. There we go. It keeps modulating in our ears, doesn't it? I can't tell if you guys can hear us or not. But if you can hear us, thank you for being here. Thank you for tuning in. The PowerUp Live stage is brought to you by Vartzilla Energy Optimization and Storage. I'm Nico Johnson, your host. We got a conversation coming up right now with PV Magazine. I can't wait to hear what PV Magazine is going to say. I bet Commercial Solar Guy is going to come up on the stage. If you guys are big fans of what PV Magazine does, like I am, you'll want to stick around. Keep those headphones on. Tune in here. Relax. Get your emails done. We are happy to have you here tuning in with us. Get some headphones if you want to hear it. And thanks once again to Burns Mac.
Hello, welcome to the PowerUp Live stage, presented by Wärtsilä Energy and Storage and Optimization. I'm Ann Fisher, I'm Senior Editor of PV Magazine USA, and I'm here with Ryan Kennedy, Editor, John Fitzgerald Weaver, also known as Commercial Solar Guy, our contributing editor. And we're here to talk about covering RE+, what we've seen so far, and what we hope to see, and some trends that we've spotted. And first, let's start with John. You want to tell us a little bit about being Commercial Solar Guy?
Sure. Thank you, Ann. Ryan, very nice to see you again. And RE+, it's wonderful being here. Commercial Solar Guy is really hard to do because every day I wake up and I write for all of you and I write for PV Mag, and then I do my best to try and run a small EPC contractor who is also a consultant in the Northeast, New England. So every day I go from trying to take care of you, Ann, and from 8 to 10 a.m. writing as hard as I can, and then head into the office. And we have 7 employees at CSG now, and we're doing we're building now. So we've slowly moved up the food chain from me being a consultant back in 2015 with Commercial Solar Guy to being a developer in 18 through 20, and now that our GC license, general contractor license, is in place, we've been constructing. We have 2 cool ongoing projects right now. One is a carport plus a battery on an Air Force base just outside of Boston. And we're also doing a small, medium-sized behind-the-meter, about 290 kW for Harvard University. So pretty soon I'm going to write an article that says Commercial Solar Guys going to Harvard. And I'm looking forward to that. But, we're more EPC, but we're trying to add development more so. And it's a challenge. Cash flow is a challenge. Having the teams in place to do all the work, to manage project management, setting up the O&M afterwards. It's work every day, every single day. So it's pretty great, and I would definitely say we're busy. We're very, very busy and trying to manage the step up of growth where we have enough capital to pay the people, to do the work, to take the deals in, and each different piece. So yeah, it's stressful.
Yeah, it's been great having John freelance for us and bring that kind of boots in the ground perspective to our writing. We're here with PV Magazine USA. We're part of the PV Magazine Group, international publication all over the globe, headquartered in Berlin. Ann and I write for the USA team. And yeah, we've seen a lot of great things on the floor today. Before we jump into some floor insights, I'd like to give just a couple of high-level numbers that we've reported on recently. We do have a stack of magazines over there, so if you're curious to follow along, there's some on the coffee table over there. But as reported by through Q2, we've seen a lot of growth in the industry. In domestic manufacturing, we've seen module manufacturing grow from 31 gigawatts in 2024 to 60 in 2026. And at the end of Q2 2024, we've reached 42 gigawatts of solar module production in the United States. That's a lot. We added 11 alone in the first quarter of 2024. So we're really seeing a boom time right now for manufacturing. And a lot of companies, I'm sure you spoke to some on the floor, are moving on to U.S. shores because of the rich incentives that you have in the Inflation Reduction Act. Since then, through Q2, since the IRA has been passed, we've seen over 31,000 new jobs in solar manufacturing alone added in the United States. And I'm sure a lot more are going to come from the announcements that we've seen on the floor today. Yeah, and along with that, too, we're looking at, through 2027, a forecast of about 61 gigawatts of wafer manufacturing. And, as we continue to expand manufacturing in the U.S., we're looking to see earlier stages in the supply chain get addressed, the cells, the wafers, up to the polysilicon. So that's a couple of high-level insights, but maybe we can pivot back over to some high-level information about just RE Plus at the event and some of the things you've been seeing.
Yeah, so this event shows how busy the industry is and how much it's growing, because this event, we have 45,000 registrants. We're going to check on that number at the end, but it sure looks like it. It's a busy time, and we've made a lot of changes. We've gone from the solar coaster to the solar century. So we're growing, we're moving, we're maturing, and it's very obvious here. So we've covered all kinds of things on PV Magazine USA this week, and we'll continue the coverage. We've seen some great products out there, some excellent solar solutions. Anything that's popped out to you, John, this week?
Yeah, I got a boatload of stuff I'd love to talk about, but I'm only given about 15 or 20 minutes here, so that's all we got. But the one thing that at the highest level, good energy, good growth, 45,000 people, 1,350 exhibitors, and nobody in here is talking about cutting back. It's all about how to expand, how to grow, how to capture what's happening. That's what it feels like. Even PV Magazine, I think we have 4 positions we're hiring for, the Eckert. So if any of you have an interest, we're always looking for writers, editors, people who can contribute. And if anybody is looking for a great marketing tool to grow your business, I've written over 1,000 articles for PV Magazine starting in about 2018, and I would say that the lead generation that comes from my writing, which leads into my own website for my own company, is probably what has driven 85% of our business over the last 5-6 years. So just a tip if you want to learn and write and put stuff out there. The biggest thing that I'm seeing, and this is kind of a continuation for when I went to Intersolar in Germany this past June, is the number of battery solutions that are out there. And they're just exploding. We could have a show just of batteries probably if we wanted to. And to be honest myself, I'm still intimidated by a lot of batteries because there's just so much tech out there, so many questions, so much to do with them, O&M to manage them, dealing with how to sell the energy. I'm really watching as the battery management systems start to evolve is really something that I'm paying attention to. I saw multiple companies selling platform solutions. I visited Schneider and their EV Connect platform, which they're looking to offer software solutions to people that want to install charging hardware but don't have a platform to manage it and don't have a 24/7 call service. If any of you own an EV, especially if it's on the Electrify America network, you know that the EV charges are down. It just happens. If you have a Tesla, they're almost always up. But if you go up to your charge point, if you go to your EVgo, if you go to your Electrify America, it's going to be down sometimes. Schneider wants to offer 24/7 call services, management services on a platform level. So they're offering solutions for people scaling. I visited Tigo, and Tigo has the same thing. So of course, Tigo's always offered you monitoring on a module level as they moved up from their various components. But one of the things that they're showing off at their booth is a platform level for installers, so they can watch their whole project, so they can get support from Tigo, so that they can install stuff and track it well. And I'm seeing it with batteries too. People are just looking platform level, broader level. This reminds me of 3 to 5 years ago when I was hearing on the utility scale development level that the investor folks wanted better data access to these projects so they could evaluate them and put values on them better. So it seems like the software people are pushing hard to get into the data and make it so we have better access to things on a large scale so that you're not doing onesies and twosies. So you have 50 projects, 100 projects, 1,000 projects in a system that can be centrally managed, quantified, and monetized. So that's one thing I notice a few of is just these platform conversations.
Yeah, it's been really cool to see energy storage mature, and we're not talking to battery providers anymore. They're solutions providers, and they're helping out with EPC, and they're integrating software, and they're making it more of a turnkey solution. Each year that I've come to this event, more and more battery providers are more solutions oriented and making those partnerships. So that's been really cool to see.
Yeah.
Yeah. One trend that I've seen increasingly over the years is 2 companies collaborating on 2 companies that offer very different solutions collaborating on a combined solution. And one of them that I just saw was Briggs & Stratton and Solarc. they're launching package solutions of the inverter and the battery together, and I think we'll start seeing more of that. And we do the RE Plus booth tours, which Ryan conducted 2 of them yesterday, and I know that energy storage was big on that too. You went to SMA. Can you tell us something about what SMA is offering?
Yeah, SMA. I mean, it's another one of those providers that you originally may have thought of them as just an inverter provider, but now they're getting into storage. They're integrating it, and it's that solutions-oriented approach. And we had a couple other similar stories where we spoke to what started as a battery provider, and now they've found a way to bring in an inverter or software, and it's a more holistic approach with it. And I think that's important, especially in a place like California where energy can be so complicated. The billing regimes are changing all the time. We shifted into NEM 3.0, and batteries are just more and more essential to home energy as well as at the grid scale. So, it only makes sense that it's evolving into that solutions-oriented approach where you're simplifying it for the customer and managing the electricity.
Yeah, you mentioned SolarArc. That's one of my favorite inverters. They've recently moved into the small commercial 30 and 60 kW units, 3-phase, but their residential battery, they were showing it off. I've dealt with them recently and Fortune, and both of them have inverters that are hybrid inverters, and it's the first time I've casually used a hybrid inverter. I used a Fortune inverter because they had a few key features that were really nice. I had an export limit on the local transformer that was 50 kW on the pole, but the customer wanted 112 kW on the roof. So, we had an east-west roof, so first I did a energy production analysis to see how much we would lose. Then we limited our inverter output to 72 kW, but our grid output to 50 kW, and we snuck some batteries in there. So we managed to get 112 kW on the roof where we can only net meter export 50, feed the site first, and we're probably not going to have any energy loss, I'm hoping, in the design. And that's because this Fortune battery, this Fortune inverter system allows for customization. SolarArc I like because, and this is what they were showing off at their booth, they take all that stuff you used to see with an off-grid system, Midnight Solar, charge controllers, all these cool gear. Outback Solar used to be our go-to there, but SolarArc has squeezed it all into one machine. And man, if I was doing resi, my own house right now, if I was in the woods, SolarArc might be the choice because it just squeezed everything in there. And so I like seeing this residential and small commercial battery tech grow because the small C&I space is still not getting the right attention for battery solutions. It's, the small ones work well, they're very simple. The big ones scale, they have great, but that in-between space, that 50 kW up to 500 kW, dealing with demand charge management, doing 1,000 volt versus 1,500 volt, there's this little collection of things that gives headaches, and I'm still trying to figure it out. But it's evolving, it's coming. So this smarter inverters, batteries, tying them together, it's happening, and it's nice to watch.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think maybe we could share a couple more high-level highlights from the magazine. We did partner with SIA and SEPA to develop a special edition magazine that I'm reading through here. There's a couple more copies over at the coffee table if you're interested, as well over at the PV Magazine booth. But yeah, you mentioned residential solar. Solar broadly, we've reached now 5 million installations in the United States, and those numbers are really expected to balloon and continue to ramp up. We're expecting that to double by 2030 and reach 10 million installations. And then another 4 years from then, in 2034, we're expecting 15 million individual separate solar installations. At the end of the year, the U.S. is expected to reach 40 gigawatts. And, sorry, that's within the year. 40 gigawatts installed this year alone. And then through the end of Q2 2024, we've officially reached 200 gigawatts of installed solar in the United States. So a couple more high-level insights for you there.
Yeah, it's exciting. And another trend that I've spotted is big companies like Eaton. They've announced the AbleEdge home energy management system. So Eaton's not known for resi and it's exciting to see big companies, looking down and moving down into residential. And as Ryan said, residential's booming.
Well, this year they might fall off around 5 to 10%. I've been doing Roth, MK something. They just changed the name, but Roth Capital. They've been suggesting that next year we might see residential return to growth of 5 to 10%, maybe 5 to 15% versus this year. But it's still a decent volume because we've had significant growth over the last 2, 3, 4 years. So a lot of people are hurting resi-wise, but it's still moving. It's still growing. It should be coming back.
Yeah, hopefully with some potential interest rate relief and solutions, costs of products and components going down, combined with people shifting their sales pitches around the changing legislation, hopefully we'll start seeing it move back into the growth area. I've also been seeing anywhere from about 5 to 15 as on the most optimistic end, 20% growth next year, but that's probably a little rosy.
And also needed is some stabilization as far as net metering policies go, state by state, and getting utilities to settle in on prices. And there's a lot of uncertainty in the market right now. But you wouldn't see it here at RE Plus this week. So as Ryan said, we do this collaboration. We've done this 3 years in a row now with RE Plus, and it's that is our U.S. edition, and then we also produce the Global magazine, which also covers U.S., and they're both available in our booth, which is at A6.
So the one thing that I've really enjoyed watching for various reasons is the excitement of domestic content. Number one, because it's great to get another 10% adder to the tax credit. Just absolutely bumps the ROI in many different ways. It's really awesome, especially in a high interest market. Taking 10% of a project cost and moving it away from the interest portion of the loan and turning it into an early stage tax credit is great. But also just hearing people talk about bringing manufacturing into the U.S. and people being excited about it. Golian, they're a Chinese battery manufacturer, and they're about to have a facility in Illinois where they manufacture the whole machine. Right now, you can buy a full 5 megawatt hour, 20-foot shipping container battery from them that's assembled in the United States. In about a month to two, you'll be able to buy the same component from them that includes the battery management system, the BMS, that's assembled in the U.S., that's manufactured in the U.S., along with the assembly. Next year, Q3, they'll be making the battery cells in the U.S. So by the time Q4 of next year, you'll probably take delivery in 2026, but you'll have a full 5 megawatt hour battery system that is fully assembled, fully manufactured in the United States. As of yet, the company is probably going to be importing the lithium, carbonate, and other basic materials that go into the cells. But they said they're exploring U.S. lithium sources. I don't know if that's real yet. But seeing a large battery kit being built in the U.S., he talked about the savings for shipping when you're sending a $40,000 shipping container from wherever around the world. That's $3,000 to $5,000 right there just to move a shipping container from Asia to the west coast of the United States. So seeing him talk about that, and the guy at the booth was excited. It's kind of cool. We were both mutually excited talking about the battery. It was a big battery. I got to touch it. It's like, oh yeah. But it's just neat to see that.
Yeah, it's an exciting time. We're seeing manufacturing jobs come back to the United States that have been gone for a really long time. And, that's something to get excited about. Since IRA, we've seen this is through Q1, so this is, I'm sure, ballooned significantly since then, but we've seen over $121 billion in new investment announcements for clean energy manufacturing. And what's driving that is it's the carrot, well, not the carrot and the stick. It's really just double carrot. You're getting demand side and you're getting supply side support. So you get that 10% domestic content bonus with your project if 40% of your components are made in the U.S. And then you're getting all those manufacturing incentives if you're the producer. So on the supply side, you're getting that support too. So that's why we're seeing this unprecedented growth right now and a real revival in clean energy manufacturing. If you're curious about those incentives, you can check them out on our website, but also page 22 of that special edition there. We have a little chart kind of laying out what those incentives are, component by component.
Right.
And yeah, they're really lucrative. I mean, there's a reason people are investing on U.S. shores right now.
Enphase is releasing their commercial inverter that is going to be fully domestically manufactured shortly. Pretty much, I was speaking with them earlier, they said pretty much every component in the unit, including the PCB boards, will be manufactured in Texas and South Carolina. With the new IRS guidance, Treasury guidance on the domestic content, a micro inverter can meet 35% of the 40% required to get the domestic content. So hypothetically, and this is the sales pitch I got from Bob Montanaro, who's my Enphase sales guy, he says if you use our Enphase unit, we have about 110 kW rooftop we're working on right now, that alone can get you to 35% of the 40 needed, and you don't need a domestic content solar module to get you over 40%. You can have your micro inverter that's manufactured in Texas or South Carolina get you 35 out of 40. That's like 80% of the way to your domestic content requirement just with the micro inverter. Now, micro inverter is more expensive than my SMA string inverters by a nice chunk, but you know, it works out with the math. So it's just, you know, we're seeing this evolution that's occurring right now with our hardware origination, how it's going to affect our ROI, how it's going to affect these things. And there's just many manufacturers. I spoke to ISRA. They're actually a German company who makes machines that analyze solar cells as they're being put through the manufacturing process. And apparently, just in the cell manufacturing printing side of it, just for the cells, there's 40 different machines that they might sell to a 2 gigawatt manufacturing line that look at the cells at various points. Some find cracks, some find this, some find miscoloring, some do binning. And he said that for the first time in 10 years, they sold a full cell analysis manufacturing system to a US-based customer. And now they have like 5 to 10 additional deals that are in the works. They said the wafer stuff is coming. It hasn't moved as fast, but the cells are coming. And they're selling the system. So it's no longer announcements. He said there have been a lot of announcements that they're talking to people and they're going real slow with. You know, there's this trade-off. It's we'll announce the factory, but then we got to sell the modules so that we can get the sale document to get the finance to buy the machines to build the factory. So sometimes you're going to hear an announcement. It's not real until you actually buy their modules, and then they'll deliver them in 2026 or something. But there's a little dance that's going on with the cell side of it. The modules are racing ahead. It's quick and cheap, quote unquote, to build a module assembly factory. Cell factory's a little bigger, a little more expensive, wafer more so, and then when we get to the poly and the ingot pulling, it's even bigger. But the machine makers, the people that make the machines that make the solar cells, are optimistic, and that's kind of cool to hear that on the floor.
It's a great sign, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we'll be covering manufacturing in spending a whole day on it in PV Magazine USA Week in October. So, Ryan, do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, we're really excited to share that in late October, the 22nd through the 24th, we'll be hosting PV Magazine USA Week. Sort of an evolution of what we used to do every year, which was the roundtables. We've now since expanded it to a 3-day event. The overall theme of it is a solar-powered economy. So we'll bring together in a virtual conference U.S. leading experts from across the industry talking about solar as well as storage in the industry. Day one is sort of like an economic case for solar. The title is Solar Wins on Cost. And we'll be looking at sort of some of the numbers that we shared today of the growth figures, but also how solar is continuing to lower in cost and win on LCOE and really be the cheapest source of new build electricity in a lot of markets. And if you check out the website, as well as pvmagazineusa.com. You'll have some information about who our panelists are. They're already booked, and we're really excited about some of the big names in the industry that we have for that. Day 2, October 23rd, we'll be hosting the Home Energy Evolution Day. That'll be a little bit more focused on the distributed side and how, like we were talking earlier, how residential solar is evolving. We're looking at not just component providers, but full solution providers, inverters, batteries, panels, everything, energy management at home, smart apps, EV charging, kind of looking at that holistic distributed energy ecosystem. Yeah, and then the third day is Solar Ignites U.S. Manufacturing. We talked a lot about on our panel today how exciting it is to be in solar manufacturing right now. So we'll have some of the biggest names of folks that have already had operations here in the U.S. and are supporting domestic manufacturing, as well as international players that are supplying to the U.S. and investing in the U.S. And building here. So really excited to share all the speakers we have. We have keynotes, interviews, startup pitches. It's going to be an action-packed full day, 3-day event, October 22 through October 24th. Really excited to share our information on that day.
Yeah, so
Last cool thing I noticed was the continuing evolution of large-scale, of utility-scale solar rolling out. Recently, we installed our first A-frame system from APA Racking, and the A-frame was really useful at this site because it was just a little bit rocky. We couldn't drive piles. The piles were getting destroyed as they got through a certain number of feet. We were going into clay and rocks, and the A-frame system, which is available. If you go to the APA Racking booth, you're going to see the A-frame underneath 6 or 7 different tracking solutions and racking solutions, so they're really helping find foundations. The A-frame solution, I think, is being proven as being a smart one because Omco developed one, and then Omco got bought out by Nextracker. And so now if you go check out the Nextracker booth, you're also going to see them also on essentially an A-frame type of solution. It's a different solution than the APA one, but it just shows that foundations are evolving. Also, in this side, if you go upstairs, I believe, we have the Build It robot team, which wants to robotically install piles on large-scale systems. And they didn't have a robot here, so I was kind of disappointed in that, but whatever. They had pictures of it. I don't know. I wanted to touch the robot.
I did see some Boston Dynamic robots running around
Yeah,
somewhere
that little,
on the floor. So
that little dog robot.
That was fun.
That's
yeah.
both terrifying and cool.
Yeah.
So, yeah. So I guess we got like 12 seconds left, Ann. You got to get us all off of here before we talk too much.
okay, well, I guess that's a good place to stop.
Thank you very much for joining us. PV Magazine USA. We write like 100 articles a day across all of our websites. Please read. And Ryan Kennedy, Ann Fisher. Ann's the boss. Say hi to Ann at the booth, So thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Yeah.